In the dead silence of a snowy mountain, a scream echoed down the canyon. Not from a gunshot, not from an animal caught in a trap. It was the sound of a girl, only 18, being tossed from a cliff like a piece of garbage. Her only crime was saying no to the man who owned the town, the man who wore the badge, the man they called Sheriff Hollis Tarp. The folks in Dry Creek, they watched it happen. Some from their windows, some from the edge of the street. They whispered, they looked away, but not a single one of them stepped in. Because in Dry Creek, silence wasn't just golden, it was currency. The kind you paid to stay safe, to stay warm, to pretend the devil wasn't walking your streets every single day. But they were wrong about one thing. They thought no one saw. They thought the snow would cover their tracks, cover their sin. Far below, hidden in a valley the world had forgotten, one man saw everything. A rancher with a ghost for a wife and a past he'd drunk 1,000 bottles trying to bury. A man with nothing left to lose. And in his pocket, his hand tightened around a memory. A memory of a small silver cross. The same cross he was now seeing glinting around the neck of the broken girl in the snow. A cross that belonged to the woman he had buried 16 years ago. This is the story they tried to bury in snow. But some legends don't stay buried. Some truths, they claw their way back out of the frozen ground, and they come back angry. They say the wind in Dry Creek had learned to whisper. It was the kind of place where men forgot how to shout and women forgot how to speak at all. The silence clung to the warped wood of the buildings, to the rusted weather vane on the church steeple that hadn't turned in a decade. It was a thick, heavy thing, that silence. And the man who sold it, the man who enforced it, was Sheriff Hollis Tarp. He was a tall man, Tarp. Lean and hard like a fence post carved from bone. His coat was always clean, even when the rest of the town was drowning in mud. His hat never blew off in the wind. And his boots sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin lid every time he walked across the saloon floor. He didn't keep the peace with a kind word or a steady hand. He kept it with control. A quiet, cold control that could freeze a man's blood with a single look. And anything he couldn't control, he simply removed. That winter, just before the big storm rolled in, a girl named Clara turned 18. She was the daughter of a woman nobody remembered and a father nobody ever named. She'd been raised by the old barkeep's widow, a woman named Miss Hattie, who taught her 3 things: how to read, how to stitch a wound, and how to never, ever walk with your eyes on the ground. Clara had a stare like flint. It wasn't fiery, not loud, but you knew if you struck it the wrong way, it would spark, and that spark could burn the whole damn town down. Sheriff Tarp saw that stare, and something in him, something cold and possessive, decided it belonged to him. It wasn't about love. It was about ownership, like a prize horse you break until it forgets how to run free. So the visit started, not with a bang, but with a quiet, unsettling creep. He'd just appear on Miss Hattie's porch, rocking in the chair like he owned it. He'd say he was just checking in, keeping the peace. But his eyes were always on Clara. He brought gifts, a blue ribbon that looked like a bruise against the faded wood of the porch railing, a book of psalms with a leather cover so dark it seemed to swallow the light. He never handed them to her directly. He'd just leave them there, like offerings at a tomb. And Clara, she never touched them. She'd leave them on the porch until the rain warped the book and the ribbon bled its color onto the wood. It was a silent war fought with unopened gifts and unwavering eyes. And the whole town of Dry Creek held its breath, waiting to see who would break first. The day she turned 18, the air in the town changed. It got thicker, heavier. The women in the general store suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The men who used to tip their hats now just nodded, their faces grim. Even the preacher, a hollow-chested man named Reverend Graves, paid a visit to Miss Hattie. He said perhaps it was time Clara learned her place in the world, lest God himself decide to teach her a lesson in humility. It sounded like a warning. It felt like a threat. The next day, Sheriff Tarp came again. This time there were no gifts, no ribbons, no books, just a proposition laid out on the porch like a dead animal. He would make her his wife. He said it like a man closing a business deal, not like a man asking for a hand. He promised her protection, a home, the kind of respect a sheriff's wife was given. He said he'd seen too many girls in Dry Creek end up with nothing, and he didn't want that for her. He was offering her the world, his world. Clara looked at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. And then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't a cruel one either. It was the kind of smile that says, "You are not worth the breath it would take to say no." She didn't have to say a word. Her eyes screamed it for her. Tarp's face went blank. The mask of civility fell away, and for a second she saw the monster underneath. He turned without a word, but the sound of his boots on the porch steps, hard and unforgiving, told Miss Hattie everything she needed to know. That sound was a promise of what was to come. That night Clara didn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the snow begin to fall. It came down slow and soft at first, like ash from a distant fire. She watched it cover the street, cover the rooftops, cover the whole town in a blanket of white. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. It was the kind of snow that buried secrets. In the morning, the front door was wide open. A drift of snow had blown in across the floorboards, reaching almost to the hearth. And Miss Hattie was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for the cold, the terrible, silent cold, and a single piece of paper, pinned to the wall with a sewing needle. It wasn't a long note, just 3 words, written in the preacher's elegant, spidery script. "The Lord taketh." They found Miss Hattie 2 days later, when the thaw came just enough to reveal the edges of the creek bed. She was face down in the icy water, her dress tangled in the roots of a willow tree. Her body was covered in bruises that bloomed like dark flowers on her pale skin. Sheriff Tarp was the one who pulled her out. He stood over her, his face a mask of solemn duty. He declared it a suicide, said the poor woman must have been overcome with grief and loneliness. He said it was a tragedy. Clara stood on the bank shivering, though not from the cold. She looked at the bruises. She looked at the sheriff's clean gloves. And she knew. It wasn't a suicide. It was a message for her. That night the message was delivered. 3 men came to her door. They were Tarp's men, deputies who wore their badges like shields to hide the rot in their souls. They didn't knock. They just kicked the door in, the wood splintering around the frame. Clara didn't scream. She fought. She kicked and bit and scratched, her flint-like stare now a raging fire. But she was one girl against 3 men. It was a fight she was never going to win. No one in town came to help. The windows stayed dark. The doors stayed locked. It was as if the whole of Dry Creek had gone deaf and blind at the exact same moment. They dragged her through the snow-filled streets, her bare feet leaving a trail of blood and defiance. They took her to the one place in town where secrets were never kept, only made. The back alley behind the saloon. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and fear. A single torch sputtered in an iron bracket on the wall, casting long, dancing shadows. In the center of the alley, someone had built a makeshift platform out of old wagon boards and whiskey crates, and standing on top of it, looking down at her like a merchant examining livestock, was Sheriff Hollis Tarp. He wasn't smiling. He didn't have to. His eyes did it for him. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. One of his deputies, a man with a face like a slab of raw meat, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Starting bid," he called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. $3. $3. That was her price. That was what a girl's life was worth in Dry Creek. Less than a good horse, less than a new pair of boots, less than the silence the town was so desperate to keep. She stood there on that cursed platform, her dress torn, her arms bound tightly behind her back. Her lip was split and bleeding where one of the men had struck her, and each breath she took sent a sharp pain through her ribs. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, the only sign of the life still raging inside her. But she didn't cry. She refused to give them her tears. She looked out at the faces in the shadows, the men from the saloon, the shopkeepers, the ranchers. She looked each and every one of them in the eye, and one by one they looked away. They couldn't meet her gaze, not one of them, until her eyes landed on Hollis Tarp. He was the only one who stared back. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken her. So she gathered up every last bit of defiance she had left in her soul, and she spit right at his clean, polished boots. The sound of it was louder than a gunshot in the sudden dead silence of the alley. And just like that, the bidding stopped. The nervous laughter died in the men's throats. Tarp's face, for the first time, lost its calm. It twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't say a word. He just stepped down from the platform, his movements stiff and angry. He gave that same slight nod again, and his men took her. They didn't take her to a jail cell. They didn't take her to the preacher for a lecture on obedience. They dragged her to a wagon waiting at the edge of town, its canvas cover flapping in the wind like a broken wing. They threw her in the back like a sack of unwanted grain, and the wagon lurched into motion, heading up into the mountains. By morning, the snow was falling again, heavy and thick. It was a whiteout, a storm that erased the world. The wheels of the wagon creaked and groaned as it climbed the winding trail, each turn taking them higher and higher into the frozen wilderness. Clara lay slumped in the back, the rough ropes biting into her wrists, the cold seeping into her bones. Sheriff Tarp rode on horseback just behind the wagon, a dark silhouette against the swirling white, his long coat flapping around him like the wings of a crow. He was following them, making sure the job was done right. They stopped at the ridge, a place known as Widow's Pass. It was the highest point for miles, a sheer drop into the canyon below. There was no trial. There was no verdict. There was only the howling of the wind and the crushing weight of the silence. One of the deputies opened the tailgate. The other one grabbed Clara by the arm and hauled her to her feet. Her legs were numb and weak, but she forced herself to stand. She would not fall. She would not cower. She wanted to see it coming. She wanted them to see her face when they did it. Sheriff Hollis Tarp dismounted and walked toward her. The snow crunched under his boots. He stopped right in front of her, his shadow falling over her. He reached out with a gloved hand and placed it on her shoulder. His grip was like iron. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of coffee and contempt. He whispered something in her ear, words that the wind snatched away before anyone else could hear. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, he shoved her. Hard. For a single heart-stopping moment, she was airborne. She saw the gray sky, the white snow, the dark figure of the sheriff shrinking away. She didn't scream. There was no air in her lungs to scream. She just fell. She fell like a stone, like a forgotten memory, like a secret the town couldn't wait to be rid of. And then the snow swallowed her whole. The wind howled once, a long, mournful cry, and then it went quiet again, just like Dry Creek. The silence had been bought and paid for, and the girl who said no was the price. Calder James hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another human soul in 4 winters. His ranch, if you could call it that, was tucked away in a crooked valley just beyond the black tooth pines. It was a place where the snow came early and left late, a place the mountains themselves seemed to be trying to hide. The mountains didn't care much for people, and Calder, well, he liked them even less. The folks down in Dry Creek, they had stories about him. They said he was a ghost, haunted by the fire that took his wife. They said her death had taken the best parts of him and burned them right down to ash. They weren't entirely wrong, but they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know about the official letter from the town clerk he'd received a week after the fire, the one he'd never opened, the one that still sat in a locked box under his bed. They didn't know about the tiny hand-carved silver cross he'd buried with her, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the shovel. And they damn sure didn't know that on the nights when the moon was full and the silence in his cabin was too loud to bear, Calder still heard her voice. A soft whisper, like the rustle of leaves, seeming to hang in the rafters like smoke that refused to clear. He wasn't a young man anymore, but he wasn't old either. There was a strength left in him, a hard, stubborn strength he now spent on splitting firewood and patching the fences to keep the wolves out. He'd stopped praying the day of the fire, but he still nodded to the sky before he ate, a habit he couldn't break. And every now and then, when the loneliness got to be too much, he'd pull out the small silver locket he kept hidden away, the one he swore he'd never look at again, the one with her picture inside. That morning, he was riding the high trail along the ridge above Widow's Pass. He had no business being up there. The trail was treacherous, and a storm was brewing in the north. But something in his gut had been twisting all night. He'd had a dream, a wrong kind of dream, the kind that clings to you long after you wake up, a cold dread that sits in your chest like a loaded pistol. The snow was coming down thick now, huge, heavy flakes that erased his horse's tracks almost as soon as they were made. He pulled his collar up high and squinted against the biting wind. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was something worse. It was the sickening, muffled thud of a body hitting deep snow from a long, long way up. He spurred his horse forward without thinking. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was instinct, or memory, or maybe it was guilt, a ghost from his past pushing him on. He found the spot on the edge of the cliff easily enough. The tracks told a story that needed no words. Wagon wheels, the deep boot prints of several men, and drag marks in the snow. The tracks of one set of smaller, lighter feet, fighting every step of the way. And then, nothing. The smaller tracks just stopped. The wind was already working to bury the evidence, to smooth it all over, to keep the mountains secret. Calder dismounted and crept to the edge. The drop was steep, a jagged mess of rock and ice. Nothing could survive a fall like that. It was impossible. But then he saw it. Down near the bottom, tangled in a deep snowdrift against a cluster of black rocks. Something moved, just a flicker of motion. A hand, a small pale hand, stark white against the snow, except for the blood that stained the fingertips. The fingers twitched. He was off his horse and scrambling down the cliff face before he even knew what he was doing. He slid and stumbled, loose rocks and ice cutting at his hands. The snow filled his boots and the frigid air burned his lungs. But he didn't stop. He had to get to her. When he finally reached her, he saw that she was twisted like a rag doll a child had thrown away in anger. Her lips were a deep, deathly blue. Her hair was matted with ice and dirt. But he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. Barely there, but it was there. She was alive. And then he saw the cross. It was tangled in the bloodied strands of her hair, resting against her throat. He froze. His blood ran cold. It wasn't just any silver cross. It wasn't some store-bought trinket or something made by a church widow. It was handmade. He could see the imperfections, the slight bend in the clasp where he'd had to fix it himself, all those years ago. He had carved this very cross with his own 2 hands. He had tucked it into the cold, still hands of his wife before they nailed the lid on her pine wood coffin. His wife's cross, the cross he had buried, the cross that was gone forever. But it wasn't. It was here, around the neck of a girl who should be dead. He knelt closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He gently brushed the snow and hair from her face. He looked at her jawline, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her brow, even in unconsciousness. It was like getting hit in the chest with a load of buckshot. This wasn't a stranger. There was something terrifyingly familiar about her. Not her face, exactly, but the spirit in it. The way her fists were still clenched, even now. The way her eyes, though closed, seemed to be fighting to open. She looked like someone he used to know. She looked like his wife. The name hit him like a physical blow. Clara. But that was impossible. Utterly impossible. The preacher himself had told him. The town clerk had signed the certificate. His wife and their newborn daughter, Clara, had both perished in the fire that destroyed the east wing of the missionary outpost 16 years ago. He had never questioned it. What was the point? He had nothing left but ashes and a story that felt like a mercy at the time. But this girl was no ghost. She was real. She was breathing. She was wearing his wife's cross. She had his wife's fire, and her name wasn't carved on a tombstone. He tore off his heavy coat and wrapped her in it, his hands surprisingly gentle. He whispered to her, the same low, calming words he used with a spooked horse. "I got you, girl. I got you. You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open for just a second. They were clouded with pain and confusion. Her cracked lips parted. Don't take me back," she rasped, the words barely a breath. And then her eyes rolled back, and she was gone again, her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear to her lips to feel it. Calder didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms. She was heavier than she looked, a dead weight, and every muscle in his back screamed in protest. But he lifted her. He got her onto the back of his horse, tying her securely to his own body with a length of rope so she wouldn't fall. And then they rode. They rode back through the swirling snow, back through the suffocating silence, back through 16 years of lies he thought were dead and buried. He didn't know who she was, not for certain. He didn't know how she'd survived. He didn't know how in God's name she had come to possess his wife's cross. He didn't know why his gut was burning, like someone had finally set the truth on fire. But he knew one thing with a certainty that shook him to his very soul. He would not rest, he would not run, and he sure as hell would not be silent. Not anymore. Not with this girl, this ghost, breathing against his back. The storm was a living thing, a malevolent beast that clawed at them with icy talons, trying to drag the girl from his grasp, trying to bury her for good this time. But Calder James held on. He rode with her cradled against him, protecting her from the wind with his own body. He held her like a man carrying the last ember from a dying fire across a frozen wasteland, knowing that if that ember went out, everything went out with it. Her breathing was a fragile, fluttering thing against his back. Her skin was as cold as marble. But her hands, even in unconsciousness, still twitched, as if she were still fighting someone in a dream, too dark to name. By the time he stumbled through the door of his cabin, night had fallen completely, swallowing the forest in a thick, starless darkness. The wind howled through the pines, a sound like a grieving mother. He kicked the door shut against the storm, laid her gently on the narrow cot by the stone fireplace, and lit every lamp and candle he owned, chasing the shadows into the corners. The cabin wasn't much. A single room with a crooked roof and a wood stove that wheezed like an old man. But it was warm, and it was safe, for now. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency. He melted snow for water, tore strips from his own shirts for bandages. He examined her injuries, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. She had bruised ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a nasty gash behind her ear that was still sluggishly bleeding. The signs of a fall that no one should have survived. And yet, here she was, a miracle of stubbornness and sheer will, a single unbroken thread in a world that had tried to tear her apart. It was while he was cleaning the cut on her head that he saw the cross again, up close this time. It lay against her skin, the silver dark against her pale throat. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just a coincidence, a copy, a cruel trick of the light, of his own grieving mind. But he knew the feel of it. His own hands had carved it from a piece of a broken fence rail during the last week of his wife's pregnancy. She'd wanted their child to have something simple, she'd said. Not gold, not silver from a store. Just something true. And here it was. She stirred, a low groan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. Calder leaned in close. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "No one's going to hurt you." She turned her head slightly, a flicker of understanding in her clouded eyes. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She blinked slowly, trying to focus on his face. Then she whispered it. A single word, hoarse and cracked like old ice. "Clara." The sound didn't just hit him. It went through him. It shattered 16 years of carefully constructed walls, 16 years of silence and whiskey and regret. Clara. The name he had been told was buried under ash and soot, the name he had cursed into the bottom of 1,000 empty bottles, the name he never, ever thought he would hear spoken in this life. "Clara," he repeated, the word a ghost on his own lips. "What happened to you, Clara?" She hesitated. Her memory was a fractured thing, broken into pieces by the fall and the fever that was now starting to burn through her. But slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. The story came out in a torrent of whispered, disconnected images. A town called Dry Creek. A kind woman named Hattie who always smelled of lilacs and told her to keep her chin up. A sheriff with cold eyes and gifts she never wanted. A preacher who spoke of God's plan, but whose plan seemed to involve nothing but pain and fear for the girls in his flock. She told him about the auction, about standing on that wooden crate in the alley, the torchlight flickering on the faces of the men who had come to buy her, about the shame, the rage, the feeling of being less than human. "I didn't cry," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I wanted to, but I didn't. I wouldn't let them see me cry." Calder nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. "I believe you." "They pushed me," she said, her voice faltering as the memory came rushing back. "The sheriff, he pushed me from the cliff. I thought that was it." Calder swallowed hard against the rage that was rising in him, a hot, bitter bile. He reached down and tucked the worn wool blanket tighter around her. Her hand shot out and grabbed his, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked him straight in the eye, a spark of the old fire returning. "They told me my mama died in a fire," she said, her voice trembling. Calder's own voice cracked for the first time in 16 years. "She didn't," he managed to say. "They lied." Clara didn't cry then either. She just nodded, a single slow nod, as if some deep, hidden part of her had known it all along, as if her soul had been whispering that truth to her for years, and she was just waiting for the rest of the world to finally catch up. Her eyes searched his face, filled with a question she was almost afraid to ask. Who are you?" Calder looked at her, at this impossible girl, this ghost of his past made flesh and blood. And in that one, heart-stopping moment, all the years of loneliness, all the whiskey-soaked nights, all the words he never got to say, all the life he thought he had buried in that pine wood box. It all came crashing down around him. "I'm your father," he said, the words feeling strange and holy in his mouth. She stared at him, her eyes wide. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. And then, with the very last of her strength, she moved her head from the pillow, leaned it against his chest, and whispered two words that broke him and rebuilt him all at once. "I knew." He held her then. He held her like he should have held her the day she was born. He held her like the world was on fire, and she was the only thing worth saving. He held her like he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the world would try to take her from him again if he ever let go. But this time, it wouldn't succeed. Not now. Not ever. Because the girl they had tried to break hadn't broken. She'd been thrown from a mountain, but she was still breathing. And Calder James wasn't about to let her fall again. There are things buried in snow that don't melt come spring. Secrets, names, sins that have no tombstones to mark their passing. And that morning, as the storm finally broke and a pale, watery sunlight filtered into the small cabin, Calder James realized he hadn't just found a daughter. He had dug up something much deeper, something colder and more dangerous than the mountain itself. Clara was sleeping, her breath finally coming in a deep, steady rhythm. The fever had broken in the night, but Calder hadn't slept. He couldn't. He sat by the dying fire, a heavy, leather-bound ledger open on his lap. It was his wife's old ledger, the one she used to keep track of supplies and seasons. The pages still smelled faintly of the dried flowers she used to press between them. And soot. It still smelled of soot. He turned to the first blank page. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and he started to write. He wrote down names, not just the names of the men who had thrown his daughter from a cliff. He wrote down the names of the men who watched, the men who whispered, the men who profited from the silence. Because he understood now. The sickness in Dry Creek wasn't new. It hadn't started with Clara. It was an old, festering wound that had been covered up for years. And Calder had been quiet for far too long. He started with the sheriff, Hollis Tarp. He wrote the name slowly, deliberately, pressing the charcoal so hard it almost tore the page. The T looked like a cross. The P looked like a noose. He remembered the first time he'd met the man. Tarp was just a young deputy then, newly arrived in town. He still had a bit of a boyish charm, a quick smile. But the handshake was all wrong. It was limp and cold, like holding a dead fish. The handshake of a man with no soul. Next, he wrote the name of the preacher, Reverend Simeon Graves. It was Graves who had come to him after the fire, his face a mask of sorrow. It was Graves who had put a comforting hand on his shoulder and told him that his wife and newborn child were with the Lord now. Calder remembered collapsing at the preacher's feet, his body racked with sobs. And all the while, the preacher had held him, patted his back, and lied. He had lied through his teeth while the church bells tolled for the dead who weren't dead at all. He added more names to the list. Deputy Miles, the hulking brute who had guarded the saloon doors on the night of the auction. Judge Riley, the man who signed death certificates without ever seeing a body, as long as the price was right. Even Miss Darlene, the woman who ran the general store. She always had an extra jar of imported honey for the sheriff's favorites, and a cold, dismissive stare for any girl who looked too independent, too defiant. Each name was a nail in the coffin of Dry Creek's silence. He wasn't writing a list for vengeance. He was writing a list for justice. The kind of justice that didn't come from a courtroom or a judge's gavel. The kind of justice you had to take for yourself, one name at a time. By mid-afternoon, Clara was awake. She sat up slowly, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. Calder was at her side in an instant, helping her sip some water, handing her a warm, damp cloth to clean the dried blood from her face. "You remember anything else?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Anything at all?" Clara nodded, her eyes distant, looking at something only she could see. "There were others," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Girls before me, younger ones." She took a shaky breath. "The church used to send girls away on retreats, to a special mission house up north. Some of them never came back. The ones who did, they were different. Quiet, broken. They didn't speak anymore." She swallowed hard, the memory painful. "One of them, a girl named Sarah, she told me she saw the sheriff. She saw him push her older sister down the old well behind the parsonage. No one believed her. They said she was lying for attention. A week later, Sarah was sent on a retreat. She never came back either." Calder's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth would crack. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of his chair. "They used the church," Clara said, her voice hollow and dead. "They used God's name. Reverend Graves would give sermons about the sins of women, about the need for purification through pain. He told us we were born wicked, that we had to be cleansed." "And you believed him?" Calder asked, his voice a low growl. She looked him square in the eye, and for the first time he saw the full, unyielding strength of her mother staring back at him. "No," she said. "I never believed him, but they made sure everyone else did." Calder stood up and walked to the small, grimy window, looking out at the melting snow. The brown, scarred earth was beginning to peek through, like an old wound finally being exposed to the air. He turned back to face her. "There's more," he said, his voice heavy. "More they never told you." Clara tilted her head, her eyes questioning. "I was told you died with your mother in the fire," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But I never saw the bodies. The preacher, the sheriff. They wouldn't let me near the ruins. They just showed me a freshly dug grave and told me it was all over." Clara was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I don't remember her face. I just remember her voice, singing." A faint, sad smile touched Calder's lips. "She sang like the wind through the pines," he said. "Soft, but it made you listen." He paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final, devastating blow. "She didn't die in that fire, Clara." Clara looked up, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. "She was killed," Calder said, his voice low and flat, stripped of all emotion. "They killed her, after she refused to hand you over to them." The words hung in the air between them, as heavy and cold as a tombstone. It was a truth that cut like a knife, but a truth that also cauterized a 16-year-old wound. "I thought I buried her," he said, his voice cracking. "Turns out, I just buried their lie." Clara took a long, shuddering breath, absorbing it all. The lies, the cruelty, the murder of a mother she never knew. Then her eyes cleared. The grief was still there, but now it was forged into something else, something hard and sharp. "So," she asked, her voice steady and clear, "what do we do now?" Calder walked back to the table and picked up the ledger. He flipped it open to the page filled with the names of the damned. "We ride," he said, "but not to kill." She looked at him, confused. "We ride to tell the truth," he explained, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "We're going to stand in the middle of that town, in front of every coward who turned a blind eye, and we are going to speak the names. Every single one of them." Clara nodded slowly, a fierce light growing in her eyes. "And then what?" Calder closed the ledger with a solid thud. "Then," he said, "we let the town decide if it wants to keep its comfortable silence, or if it wants to burn with it. A smile touched Clara's lips, the first real smile he had ever seen on her face. It wasn't a soft smile, it wasn't a sweet one. It was the smile of a girl who had been thrown from a cliff and had climbed back up. The smile of a girl who finally knew her mother's song and had just heard her father's truth. They packed light. The ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, a small tin of coffee, and 2 rifles that hadn't been fired in years, but still knew how to bite. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, Calder stepped out of the cabin. He felt the cold, clean wind on his face, a wind that no longer whispered of sorrow, but of reckoning. He settled his hat low on his brow. Behind him, Clara stepped out into the snow. The silver cross around her neck caught the last rays of the dying light, glinting like a promise or a warning. The names had been buried for 16 years, but not for long. They were going to ride down into that valley of silence, and the town that had buried the truth was about to hear every single word. They rode at sunrise. Not because the morning light offered any comfort, or because the trail was clear. They rode at sunrise because some things can't wait for the world to be ready for them. Sometimes, the only way to break a 16-year silence is to ride straight into the heart of the town that built it and start shouting. Calder's long coat flapped behind him in the wind. His rifle was slung across his back, not as a threat, but as a statement. It was a memory that was about to be woken up. Clara rode beside him, her back straight, her jaw set. Her body still ached with a pain that would take months to heal, but there was a new strength in her, a fire in her eyes that the fall had not extinguished, but ignited. The silver cross at her throat seemed to catch the morning sun, throwing off sparks of light like a tiny flare, signaling their approach. The journey down from the mountain was a quiet one. There were no words left to say between them. Everything that needed to be understood had been passed in the silence of the cabin, in the shared grief and newfound resolve. The only sounds were the crunch of their horses' hooves on the thawing ground and the slow, heavy churn of memory hardening into purpose. They reached High Ridge just before noon. It was the last bluff that overlooked Dry Creek, a vantage point from which you could see the entire, crooked layout of the town. The church steeple, listing slightly to the left, the sheriff's office with its faded, tilted sign, the saloon, where the laughter always sounded a little too loud, a little too forced, and the alley, the dark, narrow space behind the saloon where Clara had stood on a wooden crate, her life valued at $3. "It's funny," Clara said, her voice dry and raspy. "From up here, it all looks so small, so insignificant." Calder didn't answer right away. He was staring at the church, at the bell tower silhouetted against the pale sky. "You think that bell ever rang for something real?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Or was it just to cover up the sound of the lies?" Clara looked down at the oilcloth-wrapped ledger in her hands. It felt heavier than a block of iron. It was filled with names, with sins, with the collected weight of years of cowardice. She clutched it tighter to her chest. "We tell them," she said, more to herself than to him. "We tell them everything." Calder nodded, a single grim motion. "We tell them all." They rode down the final slope and into town. They didn't ride fast. They didn't charge in with guns blazing. They walked their horses at a slow, deliberate pace. The kind of pace that forces people to look. The kind of pace that makes a statement before a single word is spoken. And it worked. The town began to notice. A man splitting wood in his yard paused, his axe held in midair. Curtains twitched in windows. The front door of the general store creaked open, Miss Darlene peering out with narrowed, suspicious eyes. In the saloon, a poker game paused, the cards hovering over the table. The piano player, sensing the shift in the air, hit a sour note that hung in the sudden silence, like a bad omen. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Clara dismounted first, her movements stiff but steady. She didn't look at the staring faces. She didn't acknowledge the whispers that had already started to ripple through the street. She had one destination. She walked straight towards the church. Calder swung down from his horse and followed a few paces behind her, his hand resting lightly on the stock of his rifle. Her protector, her witness, her father. The heavy oak doors of the church were open, letting a sliver of cold sunlight cut through the dusty gloom inside. Reverend Graves was at the pulpit, halfway through a sermon about the weakness of the flesh to the handful of parishioners scattered in the pews. He looked up as their shadows fell across the doorway. His voice faltered, his eyes widened. He froze, his mouth open mid-sentence, like a man who had just seen a ghost. 2 ghosts. Clara walked down the center aisle, the sound of her worn boots echoing in the cavernous space. She didn't stop until she reached the pulpit. She looked up at the preacher, her face unreadable. "Don't stop on our account, Reverend," she said, her voice surprisingly loud and clear. "Let's hear the rest of it." Reverend Graves opened his mouth, then closed it again. A sheen of sweat appeared on his upper lip. He looked from Clara's face to the dark, imposing figure of Calder standing by the door. I have a sermon of my own," Clara announced, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "It's about sin, the real kind, the kind that doesn't come from your scriptures." She unwrapped the ledger and slapped it down hard on the pulpit. The thud echoed through the church like a judge's gavel. "Names," she said, her voice dropping, forcing the people in the pews to lean forward. "The names of men who bought and sold girls like they were sacks of grain. The names of women who bit their tongues while their neighbors' daughters were taken in the night. And the names," she said, her eyes locking onto the preacher's, "of holy men who buried the truth under a silver cross and called it God's will." She turned her gaze to the small crowd, and for the first time since she was a child, they didn't look away. They couldn't. "Some of you," she said, her voice rising with each word, "you watched from your windows as they dragged me from my porch. Some of you told your own daughters to be quiet, to be obedient, lest the same thing happened to them. Some of you knew. You knew exactly what kind of man Sheriff Tarp was, and you tipped your hats to him anyway." Reverend Graves finally found his voice. "Now hold on a minute, child." "Don't." Calder's voice cut through the air like the crack of a whip. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with so much cold fury that the preacher physically flinched, taking a step back. Clara opened the book, and she began to read. She read the names, one by one, not shouting, just speaking them into the sacred silence of the church, each name an accusation, each name a stone cast into the stagnant pool of Dry Creek's secrets. With every name she read, a face in the crowd paled, a head dropped in shame, a husband and wife exchanged a guilty look. It wasn't just a list, it was a mirror, and it was showing every person in that church the ugly truth of their own reflection. She reached the last name. She closed the book. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. And then, a new shadow fell across the doorway. He stood there, framed by the light, his hat pulled low, his eyes unreadable. Sheriff Hollis Tarp. He stepped inside, his boots making that same familiar sound on the floorboards. He walked with the confident swagger of a man who believed he owned the very air in the room. He had walked into rooms like this 100 times before and quieted them with a single look, a single gesture. But not today. Today, no one stood up for him. No one nodded a respectful greeting. No one offered him a nervous smile. The town just watched him. Clara met his stare, her own gaze unwavering. He opened his mouth, the beginning of a threat forming on his lips. "I ought to You already did, she cut him off, her voice like ice. He took a step towards her, his hand moving instinctively towards the gun on his hip. Calder took a step forward from the back of the church, his rifle still slung, but his hands poised and ready. Tarp stopped dead in his tracks. The silence in that church was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear that he had so carefully cultivated for years. It was the silence of truth. Thick, heavy, and sharp as a razor. Tarp, for the first time in his life, looked uncertain. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for a friendly face, for anyone who would still bow to his power. He found nothing. He saw only cold, accusing eyes. He turned, making a move to leave, to escape the trap that had just snapped shut around him. But the doorway was blocked. The townspeople, the ones who had been sitting in the pews, had stood up. They moved together, a silent human wall blocking his exit. An old woman stepped forward. It was Mrs. Dent, the quiet woman who ran the boarding house, a woman no one had ever heard raise her voice. She was holding a small, faded photograph. "My niece, Abigail," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You remember her, Sheriff? You said she ran off to Denver with a traveling salesman." Tarp didn't answer. He just stared at the photograph. "She never made it to Denver," Mrs. Dent continued, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "A fur trapper found her bones washed up on the riverbank 6 years later, downstream from here." Tarp's hand began to twitch. Then another person stepped forward. A blacksmith, his face smudged with soot. "My boy, you said he hung himself in the barn, but he wasn't strong enough to tie that knot. He was afraid of heights." More people came forward, more stories, more confessions. Names Clara hadn't known, tragedies that had been whispered about in secret for years, now being spoken out loud in the house of a false god. And just like that, the dam of silence broke. It wasn't a gunshot that ended Sheriff Tarp's reign of terror. It was the sound of a town, finally speaking. They didn't lynch him. They didn't need to. They stripped him of his badge, right there in the aisle of the church. They marched him down the street to the alley behind the saloon, the same alley where Clara had been sold. They didn't use ropes or torches. Their justice was colder, more complete than that. They just made him stand there, alone, while every single person in town walked by and looked at him. They watched him, their eyes filled not with hatred, but with a terrible, damning clarity. They watched him until the arrogant swagger was gone, until the cold confidence crumbled, until he was just a small, pathetic man, exposed and powerless. Clara didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched. And when it was over, when the last person had walked away, leaving Tarp to his fate, she went back into the empty church. She picked up the ledger from the pulpit and handed it to her father. "What now?" she asked. Calder looked around at the silent town, at the crooked buildings, at the great, silent mountain looming in the distance. "Now," he said, his voice softer now, "we leave it to them." And together, they walked to their horses and rode out of Dry Creek. They didn't look back. They didn't ride like fugitives escaping a crime. They rode like a man and a woman who had just been set free from a prison of ghosts. Behind them, the ridge was quiet. But it wasn't silent. Not anymore. There are stories the land remembers, long after people forget, long after the names on the tombstones have been worn away by the wind and the rain. The dirt still knows. The old pines whisper the secrets to each other. The snow carries the weight of things that were left unsaid for too long. But in the end, not even 16 years of silence can outlive the truth. They say Clara James never set foot in Dry Creek again. She didn't have to. The town carried her story long after she rode over that final ridge. Some say she joined a traveling preacher, not one who spoke of sin and damnation, but one who spoke of courage and truth. They say she spent her life protecting the souls no one else would. Others say she became a schoolteacher in a quiet, far-off valley, a place where every girl learned how to read, how to ride a horse, and how to never, ever bow her head for any man who hadn't earned her respect. And Calder? He found a piece of land in a valley where the sun always seemed to linger a little longer before it set. He built a small, sturdy house beneath a ridge that sheltered it from the winter winds. And on the patch of ground where his wife should have been buried, he planted wildflowers. Every spring, they bloomed in a riot of color, and sometimes when the wind was just right, he thought he could hear her singing. He never sought revenge. He had learned something that few men ever do, that the loudest justice isn't always the one that's shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes it's the justice that's whispered, the justice that's written down, the justice that's lived, day after quiet day. Back in Dry Creek, the sheriff's name was quietly erased from the town records, as if he had never existed at all. Reverend Graves was seen one morning riding east, with nothing but a single suitcase and his own suffocating silence for company. The people of Dry Creek changed. It was a slow change, an uneasy one, but it was real. They started talking to each other again. They started looking each other in the eye. Near the church, they carved a memorial into a large granite boulder. It wasn't for one person. It was for all the girls who never got a grave, and for all the women who had been told their suffering was God's will. The inscription was simple. It just said, "We speak now for those who never had the chance." And maybe that's what stories are really for. Not just to entertain us, not just to fill the empty air with words. Maybe they're here to say the things that have to be said, especially when it hurts. Because the West wasn't just built by cowboys and gunslingers and men with badges. It was shaped by girls who survived falls that no one should survive. By fathers who rode back through the snow when it would have been so much easier to forget. And by the voices that, against all odds, refused to stay silent. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of buried secrets and long-awaited justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because you never know what truths are just waiting to be dug up.